Welcome to your second Cultivating Creativity webinar. Today, we are going to talk about redemptive resilience. So what is it that we do with those hard, difficult, painful, challenging pieces, with the pieces of our life that maybe feel a bit messy, um, and difficult to manage at times? How do we use those, even those resources and experiences and places, um, with creativity in a way that moves us toward more fulfillment and more flourishing? So a few definitions. Um, Resilience is the capability of a strained body to recover its size and shape after a deformation caused especially by compressive stress, or an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. 2, redeem, which is the root of redemptive, to compensate for the faults or bad aspects of something, or to do something that compensates for poor past performance or behavior. So resilience is our ability to recover after these painful, hard, challenging, difficult, negative, messy experiences, stresses, traumas, and also the ability to, the more we practice resilience, to recover easily. So with agility from misfortune or change or stress. And the redeeming piece of this is like not just the recovery piece, not just figuring out how to get yourself back to normal or get something back to normal, but actually making it right, like making yourself, your spaces, your relationships, your community, this world, making it right after the bad, after the negative, after the challenging. So that's where we want to focus our creativity during this webinar, during your homework for this workshop. We're not just rehearsing difficult things. We actually want to redeem them and recover from them in a way that moves us toward fulfillment and flourishing, rather than in a way that just rehearses. So to expand on that a bit, perpetual rehearsal of bad, challenging, negative, or traumatic events isn't actually helpful. What that does is we just relive the events in our bodies, actually. So as we imagine that traumatic, painful, abusive, difficult thing, we actually relive the experience in our bodies. We get the same kind of cortisol and adrenaline release that we did. We get the same kinds of fight or flight responses. Anxiety comes up in our body in the same way. The thing is, the more we rehearse it, the more predictable the story becomes. So it might not feel as traumatic every time you rehearse it, because you know how you're going to tell the story, you know how it's going to end. But that rehearsal of the same painful, traumatic thing in the same way isn't actually helpful. It's what people just sharing their story or kind of purging out their pain is vulnerable, and it takes courage sometimes, but it doesn't move the needle toward anybody becoming better or anybody being more healed or anybody moving toward flourishing. Sometimes it helps us feel connected in our pain and suffering, but it doesn't contribute to our healing and walking in wholeness. So what is helpful is reframing those events so that the person that they happen to gains agency and can access communion. So what we're doing is reframing the events. So the person that they happened to is in charge of how they make meaning from that event. They're in charge of how the story should have gone and what needs to happen to make that story right, or what happened because of that story that they did make right, or what's the learning that they gained from that experience that then enabled them to help other people. Um, and accessing communion means that connectedness to others. So there's some basic human needs that we have, basic human motivations that we have. One of them is to gain agency or choices. Another one is to be able to access communion or belonging or connection. And so redemptive sequencing is a term that was first coined by Dan McAdams, who teaches at Northwestern University. And it's an essential developmental task for adults that it effectively increases well-being. So when you become an adult, and not before that, redemptive sequencing isn't for adolescents necessarily. It's not even for young adults or children. It's an appropriate developmental task for adults, people between, specifically between the ages of 35 and 70 years old is when redemptive sequencing is most effective and most helpful. You can absolutely start using it before then, but if you're, I wouldn't use it really aggressively with anybody before they're 25, because that's when your prefrontal cortex has been fully developed and you can reason through these things. It's also 35 is when developmentally we move into a stage that Erik Erikson calls generativity versus stagnation. So we're dealing with this crisis in adult life, a psychosocial crisis, where we are trying to determine if our life is generative, meaning, is it producing something meaningful that will move the next generation forward, that will make our descendants or the people that come after us better off than we were, by contributing to that? Versus stagnation are the things that I'm investing myself in, the energy that I'm giving to my work. Are those things actually meaningful? Are they actually impacting the next generation? Are they creating a better world? Or are they not? And if we answer that question with no, they're not real, what I'm doing really isn't. It might be good work, might be satisfying in some ways, or I might really feel like an expert around it, right? Might really feel like I know what I'm doing. But if we can't say, yes, the work that I'm doing is meaningful, generative, and producing something good for whoever's coming next, then we experience a crisis of sorts. So that's why you see a lot of people in midlife and toward retirement, they're making these transitions that sometimes seem to make sense and sometimes they don't seem to make sense. But usually it's motivated from trying to resolve this psychosocial crisis and be able to say, yes, I've gotten to this point in my life, and the things that I'm doing, the work that I'm devoting myself to, the things I'm creating are generative. They are creating something better in the world, and I'm confident in that. So a big part of this developmental stage is reviewing your life and understanding which sequences are redemptive and which sequences are contaminated. And so Dan McAdams talks about how those of us that rehearse our stories or view our messes or assess challenging, difficult, painful, traumatic, negative events from a perspective of contamination. Like, oh yeah, that thing that happened to me that ruined my life, or that wrecked me, or um, I've just never been able to recover from that, or the reason that I'm like this is because that difficult thing happened to me in a negative way, right? So the reason that I struggle with control, or the reason that I over explain myself, or the reason that I'm extra sensitive, or the reason that I'm highly anxious in this particular environment is because of this contaminated experience or sequence of events from my past, right? Rather than taking responsibility, not for the the things someone else did that harmed you, but taking responsibility for your own pain at this point and reparenting yourself, demonstrating compassion toward yourself in such a way that you're able to heal yourself rather than continue to transmit that pain to somebody else. So, redemptive sequencing is looking at those painful, difficult, traumatic events in our past, assessing them, exploring them, and figuring out how we're going to take responsibility for our own story and redeem the difficult, hard, painful thing um, by making it right in our own lives somehow. So here's a quote from Donald Miller that sums it up well. He says, "The negative turns in our lives remain negative turns. But if we're going to heal, we must find something meaningful that came to us because of our tragedies. Another benefit of finding a redemptive perspective on our suffering is that once a tragedy is redeemed, it's difficult for us to consider it a hindrance." Viktor Frankl says it this way: "When we find a redemptive perspective toward our suffering, it ceases to be suffering." So here's a few steps that you could take in um, this redemptive resilience process. As you have built out your life gallery, the second part of your life gallery, and moved through those more negative experiences in your life with the questions in that homework, go back now and see what themes you can identify. See where the mess is. This also applies to a consistent mess you've been tolerating physically. So it could be a physical space, like one that try this process out on a physical space that seems really messy and that you've had difficulty redeeming that mess in the past. That might be able to help separate the judgment or emotionality from it at first. Um, so this can work with physical spaces. This process works as you try to enact redemptive sequencing uh, over the negative events in your life gallery too. So what we want to do first is identify the mess. Where is it? What is it? We want to notice it and name it and give it kind of a place to be. The second thing is assess the mess. What's its volume? What's its quantity? How big is it? How dense is it? If even emotionally and with like these life experiences, if what might be able to hold that mess? How big would its container or carrier have to be? And also, who or what else is that mess touching? The third thing is to comprehend the mess. So not just noticing it, what it is, or assessing its characteristics, but also understanding it. how does it affect me? How does this mess affect me? And how does it affect others? And really getting curious and vulnerable with yourself around how these past experiences in your life continue to show up and impact you day to day, um, in whatever way and with whatever intensity. Number four is explore the mess. So once we've comprehended it, we can start to explore, where's the gold in all of this? Where is the strength? What's the truth? What's the learning? If I can take just a step back from this mess, from this negative, painful, difficult, traumatic experience, from this space that's overwhelming, what might be I be able to see is the strength, the learning, um, the thing that I can engage with from a place of choice, right? And then move into redeeming the mess. So, from that place that you can engage with, um, from that place that is for your good, because it has strength or resource or truth or learning in it, or possibly even connection, then what can you rescue or set free or make right? What's the thing that now that you're an adult and you're responsible and you're owning your own pain and you're seeking to transform it instead of transmit it, what can you choose to rescue or set free or make right? If it's just even up to you. And the sixth is connect from the mess. So don't do all of this in isolation. Work through steps 1 through 5, and then seek communion around, seek connection, seek belonging, a place where you can share who else needs to know that this is the process that you're in, and what support or care can you request. So that's an overview of redemptive resilience, and the kind of the content and theoretical understanding with a little bit of practical application that you can apply as you work through this part of your cultivating creativity homework as well.